What happens when love is tested not by distance, but by a hospital room and the sound of a single heartbeat? One quiet night, one fragile moment, and a fear James has never dared to say out loud. Hello everyone, hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to explore a deeply emotional chapter, the night James stays awake beside Diệp, listening to every beep, wondering what tomorrow might take away. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next episodes. The room was quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. It was the kind of silence filled with soft mechanical sounds, a slow beep, a faint hiss of air, the muted footsteps of nurses passing by in the hallway outside. Diệp opened her eyes slowly as if waking from a dream she wasn't sure she wanted to leave. The ceiling above her was unfamiliar, white, too clean, too still. For a moment she didn't remember where she was. Then she heard the beep again, and then she felt the weight of someone's hand resting lightly over hers. James was sitting beside the bed, his head tilted slightly forward, eyes half open. He hadn't slept. Anyone could tell. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair uncombed, his posture stiff from staying in the same position for hours. But the moment he felt her fingers move, he straightened instantly. "You're awake," he said quietly, his voice low, careful, as if speaking too loudly might break something fragile. Diệp blinked, her throat dry. "Well, what time is it?" James glanced at his watch, then back at her. "Still morning, you didn't miss much." That was a lie, but it was a kind one. He reached for the small cup of water on the table and helped her lift it. She took a slow sip, then another. Her hands were weak, but his grip was steady. The machine beside the bed continued its steady rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. She listened to it longer than she should have. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, her voice barely louder than the machine. James froze. "For what?" "For all of this." She gestured weakly at the room. The bed, the IV line taped to her arm, the trip, the hospital. "You shouldn't have to be here." James didn't answer right away. Instead, he adjusted the pillow behind her head, careful not to move her too much. Then he sat back down, his hand still holding hers. "I want to be here," he said finally. Diệp turned her head slightly to look at him. His eyes were tired, but focused, anchored on her. "You say that now," she whispered, "but you had plans. We had plans." James let out a slow breath. "Plans can wait." She looked away. Outside the window, the sky was pale, washed out by the city haze. The world was moving on without them. Cars, people, mornings, lives that weren't paused in white rooms with beeping machines. A soft knock came at the door. The doctor entered, followed by a nurse holding a tablet. Their expressions were calm, practiced, neutral. "How are you feeling?" the doctor asked. "Tired," Diệp answered honestly. "That's normal," he said. "Your vitals are stable. The initial tests don't show anything alarming." James felt his chest loosen just a little. "But," the doctor continued, "we'd like to keep you for observation. At least a few more days, just to be safe. A few more days, not dangerous, not urgent, but not free either." James nodded immediately. "Of course," Diệp hesitated. "Is it necessary?" The doctor smiled gently. "We'd rather be careful." After they left, the room felt heavier than before. Diệp stared at the ceiling again. "A few days," she repeated quietly. James squeezed her hand. "We'll get through it." She swallowed. "I don't want to be the reason you're stuck here." That time, James answered without hesitation. "You're not a reason," he said. "You're you." She finally looked at him again, and that was when she saw it. The fear, not panic, not hysteria, just a deep, controlled fear he was holding tightly behind his eyes. "You're scared," she said. James looked down at their hands. "Yeah." She waited. "I'm not scared of hospitals," he continued, "or doctors, or tests." He paused, choosing his words carefully. I'm scared of losing you without knowing it was happening." The machine beeped again. Diep felt her eyes burn. "I didn't know I was that important," she whispered. James looked up at her then, and for the first time that morning his voice wavered. "You're everything that makes the rest of it make sense." She cried quietly, turning her face to the side so he wouldn't see. James didn't tell her not to cry. He just held her hand tighter. Hours passed slowly after that. Nurses came and went. Medication was adjusted. Notes were written. Life in the hospital continued its steady rhythm, indifferent to how fragile everything felt inside that room. In the afternoon, James stepped out into the hallway to make a phone call. "I'm at the hospital," he said, keeping his voice steady. "She's okay, stable, just needs observation." He listened, nodded, reassured. "Yes, I'll call if anything changes." When he hung up, he leaned against the wall for a moment, eyes closed. Only then did he let out the breath he'd been holding. When he returned, Diep was asleep again. The light in the room had shifted, softer now, cooler. James sat down quietly, watching her chest rise and fall. The machine continued its rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. Night arrived without warning. The hospital changed after dark. Fewer voices, longer shadows. The hum of electricity louder than before. James sat alone while Diep slept. His thoughts ran in circles. What if the tests changed? What if the calm was temporary? What if tomorrow wasn't as simple as today? The machine beside the bed suddenly changed its rhythm, just slightly. James looked up immediately. The numbers flickered. The nurse stepped in, checked the screen, adjusted something, and nodded. "Nothing serious," she said, "just a fluctuation." James smiled politely, but his body stayed tense. When the nurse left, he leaned forward, resting his forehead near Diep's hand. "If you wake up tomorrow," he whispered, so quietly the room barely heard him. "I'll stop pretending I'm strong." He stayed like that, holding her hand, listening to the beeps, waiting for morning. Morning returned slowly, without ceremony. James woke in the chair beside the bed, his neck stiff, his hand still wrapped around Diep's. For a brief moment he didn't move. He just listened. The steady rhythm of the machine, the quiet breath rising and falling beneath the thin hospital blanket. Beep, beep, beep. It was still there. She was still here. Diep stirred a little, her brow tightening before her eyes opened. When she saw James, the corners of her lips lifted faintly. "You didn't sleep," she said. James tried to smile. "I did. Just sitting." She didn't argue. She knew better. A nurse entered with the morning routine. Blood pressure, temperature, quiet questions spoken in practiced tones. Diep answered politely, doing her best to sound normal, like this was just another morning and not a pause in everything she thought she knew. When the nurse left, Diep stared at the window. The sky was brighter now, blue, almost hopeful. "James," she said softly. "Yeah?" "If the tests come back fine, can we just go somewhere quiet after this? No plans, no schedules." James nodded without hesitation. "Anywhere you want." She closed her eyes. "I don't want to feel like time is chasing us." His grip tightened slightly. "Then we won't let it." Later that morning, the doctor returned. More tests were scheduled. Blood work, imaging. Nothing invasive yet, but thorough, careful. The word echoed in James's head long after the doctor left. Careful meant uncertain. As Diep was wheeled out for the next round of tests, James followed until he wasn't allowed to go any farther. The doors closed gently but firmly in front of him. He stood there longer than necessary, staring at the blank surface, his reflection faint and distorted. For the first time since they arrived at the hospital, he felt truly alone. He walked to the end of the hallway and sat down, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. Around him, life continued. Nurses laughing softly, a man talking on his phone, the distant sound of a cart rolling past. James lowered his head. He thought about all the moments he'd assumed would always come later. Later, we'll slow down. Later, I'll tell her how scared I am. Later, I'll say the things that feel too heavy to say now. What if later wasn't guaranteed? When Diep returned, she looked tired but calm. "Everything okay?" he asked, standing immediately. She nodded. "Just long." He helped her back into bed, adjusting the blankets, the pillow, the small things that made the space feel a little less cold. She watched him quietly. "You're shaking," she said. James looked at his hands, then stilled them deliberately. "I'm fine." She reached for him, brushing her thumb against his wrist. "You don't have to be." The words landed harder than she probably intended. James sat down slowly. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. Waiting, not knowing. Diep studied his face, the lines of exhaustion, the effort it took for him to stay composed. "You don't have to fix anything," she said. "Just stay." "I am staying," he replied immediately. She smiled, gentle but serious. "I mean, stay with me, not with your fear." James swallowed. That afternoon, the hospital grew quieter again. Sunlight moved across the floor in thin strips, marking time they weren't sure how to count anymore. Diep dozed in and out of sleep. James watched over her, his thoughts softer now, slower, less frantic. When she woke again, she asked him to tell her a story. "Any story," she said. "Something normal." James thought for a moment, then began talking about the small cafe they'd visited weeks ago. The one with the crooked chairs and terrible coffee. The way they'd laughed about it anyway. Diep smiled as she listened, her eyes closing again. For a moment, the hospital faded. In the evening, another nurse came in to check the monitors. The numbers flickered, settled, flickered again. The nurse frowned slightly, then relaxed. "Still within range," she said. "We'll keep an eye on it." James nodded, but the words lodged in his chest. Within range meant not perfect. After the nurse left, Diep noticed his expression. "Hey," she said softly. "Look at me." He did. "I'm still here," she said. "Right now. That's enough." James exhaled slowly. "I know." Night fell again. The second night felt different from the first. Less shock, more awareness. James lay back in the chair, eyes open, listening to the rhythm that had become his anchor. Beep, beep, beep. He realised then that strength wasn't about being unafraid. It was about staying, even when fear refused to leave. Diep shifted in her sleep, murmuring his name. James stood and moved closer, resting his hand over hers again. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." The machine hummed on. Outside the window, the city lights blurred into soft shapes. Somewhere beyond the walls, the world kept moving. Inside the room, everything narrowed to this: her breath, his hand, the quiet promise between them. Tomorrow would bring more tests, more waiting, more answers, or maybe more questions. But for now, there was only the night, and the sound that meant she was still alive. Beep, beep, beep.
Tập này Linda và bà Linda theo bà và cậu cháu ra nương mía. Dưới nắng sớm, bà vừa chặt mía vừa kể chuyện ngày xưa. Dậy chặt 3 hoặc 4 khúc cho đẹp để bán được giá. Đồng mía cao dần, 45 đồng trở thành hy vọng cho phiên chợ. Một cây mía đổ bất ngờ khiến cả nhóm kêu, rồi cười xòa vì kịp đỡ nhau. Chiều xuống, Linda buồn bã vì con rúi của mình đã biến mất. Nghi có kẻ trộm rình quanh nhà. CEO quang ghế đến lắng nghe và trấn an và tự sửa chiếc camera cũ trong kho, kéo dây lắp trước sân nhà để bảo vệ cô. Đêm đến, Linda nấu cơm nếp cẩm mời anh ở lại ăn. Hai người trò chuyện lòng ấm lại. Quang kể áp lực công ty, camera nháy sáng, bóng lạ thoáng qua, và không biết Linda có sống sót qua được đêm nay không. Mọi người nếu nếu thấy video hay, hãy cho mình một like, một subscribe. Cảm ơn mọi người nhé.